Oh, hi there. Oh, you're back. There's a fair group today. I hope you're enjoying some of these ideas. I think I can say somewhat confidently in my own way of thinking that they're different. They're not your run-of-the-mill ideas that you can find almost anywhere. They're not always comfortable, but interesting or different is not a bad thing in itself. Happy you're all here today. Visual perception as lived experience that is observed carefully also isn't always what they told us it is. A reminder, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Vision is magic to our minds. We've explored how associative thinking is contingent, linked to environmental stimuli, how words, ideas, and knowledges are implanted, how culture and story fabricate significant parts of our being, and how language and thinking happen to and in us. As previously remarked, most who write about the world start at impossibly abstract levels, using unexamined words and concepts as if they must surely delineate true aspects of reality. They take for granted what everyone has always presumed to be the world out there and the world in here, in our minds, the world as spoken, written, clan-sanctioned. Stories, pop science and pop psychology, for example, seem to tell us how and who we are. And we like our stories about ourselves. They make us feel exceptional. As we've been exploring, we don't see the underlying mechanics, the plumbing, so to speak, of how we use and are used by the word world. We don't observe how culture has engineered us any more than children are awake to the creation of their perceptual verbal personhoods. Scientist types only recently uncovered and are becoming cognizant of the complex reality of the six-layered cerebral brain tissue. And the cerebellum is quite a mystery too, isn't it? So big, so many cells. Extraordinarily differentiated regions and modules and interconnected nuclei develop massively reentrant, connected in parallel to the brainstem nuclei and subcortical structures of many types. And it's complexly synchronized. The whole shebang in training, organic neural nets tuned synaptically to the signal of the world, all working non-consciously to create reality. And scientist types have dissected and parsed the senses fantastically finely, finding electromechanical systems of many weird varieties. The vestibular system with its semicircular canals, enabling gyroscopic sensitivities. The eardrum, linked to the malleus incus and stapes, tapping on the cochlea. The weird architecture of the cranial nerves, etc. We've been documenting the machinery, but are more than a bit fuzzy about how it tells the brain, the homunculus, what it needs to know. And the machinery of our bodies seem to atomize the incoming signals in ways that scarcely even make sense. We have only the foggiest sense and theory of how the fragmentary and selective inputs of our senses are stitched together and melded into a whole that we experience as seamlessly, globally extended, out there, and really real, the place where we have our being. Children live vision without questioning. Don't we all? I see my room. My room is in my house, which is on my block, which is in Canada, the US, Sweden, wherever, which is on Earth, which is in the solar system, which is in the galaxy, which is in the universe. The overall presumption is I'm inside the self behind my eyes, my skull. Light comes in through my eyes, and I know the outside world mostly through my eyes. That's what I see, the outside world. Some self, again homunculus by any other name, in me receives some kind of map, image, coherent stimulation from the outside that is indeed processed, but that, in the end, effectively, to all intents and purposes, somehow is reintegrated into the experiences of the world. But, ta-dam, this rendering is completely fallacious. We will see this. We act as if, and seem to take it on faith and habit, that we have a television-like awareness that is vast and deep and populated, and that comes to us fully formed. My eyes facilitate a stable completeness of visual perception that sweeps around a world that exists of itself. What we're going to try to grok here is how visual perception also is Legoed together of disparate atomic pieces and stitched together to output what we consider reality. And if we look properly, almost yogically, we become awake and aware of how and which atom or shard we're actually seeing. We may catch a glimpse of the underlying reality. Glancing at a tree across the way. Some background. I'm sitting at my desk, glancing outside through a large open window, looking at a nifty green field where a healthy maple tree holds center stage about 20 feet away. I sit quietly and let myself become aware of and enjoin myself to remember, stay awake to, how my eyes are moving. What pieces of the perceptual whole are presenting themselves on the stage of my mind's consciousness. This reminds me of when I attempt to hear my thoughts. Normally I just throw a glance treewards, and neither glance nor tree would register. I'd not think about the tree. The way our species experiences this, the way I habitually look at something, is by glancing around and noting what I see. I see the world out there with all kinds of things in it. This time, I stop my mind from talking, stop myself from almost instantaneously moving to another detail of the scene, hold myself, keep awake to all the details that I can see. The first look is like a sweep that my eyes take. Individual glances move, bounce from what catches my attention first, very quickly slipping from background pieces that stand out in some way back to the central referent, being attracted to major features, then homing in on features that draw my interest. If I watch myself, that is, stay aware of what my visual apparatus is doing, I recognize that my eyes move continually, both in very small ways, small angles, and at other times in much larger jumps from the top to the bottom, side to side, foreground to background. Each jump, if I stay feeling the whole of what is transpiring, what is happening to my eyes and mind, each jump is like a small part, a fragment. Today, I really want to see this picture so my eyes and my awareness are much more stubborn than usual, staying with the scene. I naturally move my head in small ways, hold a posture naturally, blink. I can be aware of my eyes moving in my eye sockets. And I become aware that the central focus, what I see clearly, is a small part of a much larger, out of focus, peripheral vision, whole, which instantly moves if I want to take in the whole scene in front of me. Overall, I can feel myself wanting to see as I do habitually. Feel the tug to simply see the whole scene at once and then move on. Overall, for me, naively, it is as if I form a snapshot of the scene and store a picture of it somewhere in my noggin. A nature scene, maple tree. But now I look back at the scene and feel what I'm seeing in much more detail. Pay attention to each small snapshot, almost each saccade. Certainly awake to the constant jumping around of my central focus view. All the while working to remember how my eyes move. And I try to keep aware of images or partial images in a way I never do. At least I never do in real life, naively, under usual conditions. First off, I realize my eyes keep moving. We are almost never aware of this, it being part of the subsumed series of skills learned in the first months and years of life, and massively complexified and unconsciously mechanized ever since. We believe that we are living in a space with things in that space. But what I see when watching myself is small, quite limited, fragmentary, partial glimpses. If I feel this and watch how the mechanism is working, I keep going from small field to take in parts of the whole scene. It is truly fascinating. It's a fascinating phenomenon to stay aware of how and what my eyes are doing. If I want to focus on the maple tree, my eyes bounce all around it, taking in many pieces, branches, trunk, splotches on the trunk, a broken twig, leaf cover, general shape of canopy, etc., in a series of very quick, rather loosely defined perceptual images. This uncomfortable awareness works for a while. Yet all my life, I've believed in the whole world out there and the space inhabited by houses, trees, cars, etc. It feels weird and a bit crazy-making to hold my awareness on the constituent snapshots fragments. Realizing the perpetual motion of my eyes, the very narrow band of foveal, high-definition precision, the constant swings of my head and eyes, and I'm also feeling the unconscious jittering of attention all over the place. When you study this process scientifically with machines fast enough to capture the very quick saccades, you find the eye jiggles, changes the focused area where it alights 3 times a second. Each saccade covers a foveal area of about 11 degrees of the theoretical visual field. I can even be aware of how narrow my field of vision is and how I cannot see anything else around me at the same time while I'm focused in such a manner. And the brain blots out, never records, the partial movements, automatically protecting us from what might be described as a theoretical flicker of disjointed fragments of the whole. You, some of you who are reading this book, can glue your attention to the page in front of you. Focus on the line of type you're following. Pay attention to the individual letters and to the words appearing one by one in front of you. Feel how the eyes are perfectly trained to word process, to skip along the line of text, apparently perfectly smoothly. And obviously, but amazingly, when you're reading the words, the rest of the world is blotted out for however long you're reading, not to mention the extra dimension of the meaning world the words are creating for you. It's hard to stay straight up concentrated on one relatively nondescript thing for an unusually long time. It takes a little effort to now feel my glance alight on the car over there. 3 or 4 major 11-degree snaps. Side door, roof, hood, logo. It's a new white Ford Focus. Then the person walking by. Many saccades to take in her face, her general shape, sneakers, shorts. Then back to the maple, and another round of exploratory bounces that show my intent to see, pay attention to this star of my everyday scene that has caught my fancy. I can make myself hold my eyes for a second or two longer than usual, and then I feel the saccade of itself, moving back to what I've decided I want to look at more closely. And what I also realize, become cognizant of, is that the larger field, the background, the peripheral vision field, is quite general and non-specific, seemingly made up of textured, darker, somewhat nondescript gray-brown colors and contrasts, while the smaller foveal field is experienced like it's precisely lit up, rapidly moving, bright color zoom. That's a camera metaphor, obviously. A much more focused central area that gives me most of the information that I want. It takes concentration and stubborn attention to separate the peripheral from the central focus. My eyes kind of unfocus to let me feel the sides of what I'm seeing. It's like the periphery is large, space-like, 50 or 60% of the field, but nondescript, blurred, and without detail. The idea of a zoom is clearly a metaphor from cameras and video equipment, but a useful metaphor for now. It, the metaphor, distinguishes what feels like a much brighter, much more in-focus part of what I'm looking at from the larger visual field. The part that is really showing me what I'm observing. There's not a good clear vocabulary for any of this way of observing. Usually we have no sense or knowledge of the fovea focus versus the peripheral vision. As a matter of fact, we have no awareness of any parts of what we're looking at. Verbally, forcing it into words, it feels like the peripheral surround is the larger area, while the more defined center focus is embedded in this area. But this may be an artifact of our usual foreground, background, metaphorical descriptioning. The awareness of background, non-foveal data, feels like a general blocking out of shapes and washed out colors without the detail needed to clearly identify what I'm seeing. And the fuzzy, foggy background in some way feels like what a full-blown picture would take in. That is, it somewhat feels like the illusory space I recognize in a glance. A larger, less bouncy area, with the real color snapshot being the bright central zoom. This is not accurate, but a feeling that makes sense on a simple level. The peripheral space is also rather narrow, certainly a small part of what I would usually experience as the whole scene I'm looking at. I usually unconsciously imagine I look out at 180 or so degrees. If you're following at home from a book or a reader, you can easily find an analogous situation, something to look at and sense in a new way, and feel each of the experiences I'm describing. When I walk, I frequently attend to the constant juddering juxtapositioning of snapshots. This should be a required yogic meditation. Oh, just kidding. Another thing I can feel, which I usually never feel, is how when my eyes do large bounces, go from the car to that building to that nice looking lady over there, it feels like, if I'm trying to be conscious of the process itself, a quite quick snap jump. And it takes a split second until I recognize the new perspective and the new thing I'm now looking at. And then the zoom bounces around very tightly, getting clearer recognitions about the parts of what I'm observing. And it quickly becomes apparent that once I am interested in a particular aspect of what's around me, the zoom is bouncing around in a very quick and somewhat coherent manner, giving detail to the much more general peripheral overall subject. To my top-down, what am I looking at, interest in looking at the scene. My foveal detail focus, unconsciously, preconsciously maybe, jitters my awareness to quickly catch details of the tree, then scans the background with a few somewhat random bounces, and then, usually except that I'm writing this book about perception, is satisfied and moves on to the next dispensable scene. We literally never awaken ourselves to the atoms of visual awareness, the small foveal box that sweeps constantly, the peripheral vision's indeterminateness, the constant moving on to thousands, millions of next scene fragments that build up our daily repertoire of scenes. How the small in-focus, foveal circling, constantly finds out what I'm looking at by detailing the larger areas. In the back of my mind, I'm still aware that I want to see the scene naturally, usually as part of the life in the world. I don't particularly like to experience this scene as quite narrow fragments, snaps, parts of an intuited whole that I know signify a maple tree. In fact, I feel a bit dizzy if I do this too long, or maybe just a little disoriented, ill at ease, out of my habitual modes. An analogy for this experience is that we are cognitively blind to the individual words that make up a lightly tossed off quip to a friend. And we somewhat easily recognize that we are, in the everyday, even more blind to the constituent sounds that make up heard words. We've previously mentioned how we are cognitively blind to the many, many words that flow through our minds while we are daydreaming. We live in the lived whole that emerges from the atoms of sensation. A pattern. Constituent parts are unobserved while we feel like another realm is manifested through the shard-like fragmentary experiences. Usually I'm cognitively blind to eye movements, saccades, and all the many complex mechanisms that are taking place when I'm looking at anything around me. I'm blind to the fragmentary snaps my fovea focus alights on so many times every second or two. I will later point out by analogy that all this technology of perception is slave to in the service of abstraction, building to the high abstract plane of words, things, and stories. Above, I said that the fragments engender a sense of seeing a dispensable scene. Dispensable scene, because all day, every minute, I'm glancing at everything in my environment, constantly changing from background to foreground, splicing foveal focus snaps together, waiting for my mind for larger consciousness to direct and keep my focus for a little longer. There's a bear there. There's a blonde there. There's my friend Janet, on some object that the total system, myself, needs to specialize in. Yet the process described here is different than the process that takes place when walking through a crowd or walking on the beach. There are many different kinds of scanning our eyes perform, depending on the global environment. The cloud, the crowd, the beach, the iPhone, reading, watching the telly, and specific needs I'm trying to satisfy. I find this analogous to different kinds of thought. Here, the focus is constrained in trying to be hyper-aware of one specific scene for a lengthy period of time. This is not usual, not what my eyes usually do. nothing like our usual awareness. Next in my experiment, I try and focus on the part of the visual field that has all the detail, the foreground. A very small area where a branch meets the model trunk. I realize that there is, like structurally, like in the fovea, a central area where I see detail, but to take in more, I have to keep that area of detail moving. Details have meaning, give me information, move me to recognition. I can even do this semi-consciously for a few seconds, make myself consciously feel, make myself move my eyes to see a particular thing in a particular way in my local environment. Then, instantly, for no conscious reason, I change focus and see the background green mass of trees behind the central area I've been concentrating on. Then again, I move back to the maple, see the trunk, focus on the textured lines up the model trunk, then the leafy bower, then focus more on the way the trunk meets the grass, etc., etc. I'm aware that I'm being much, much more organized in this than I usually. Obviously, in the everyday, I'm completely unconscious about everything about the process of seeing. I am more organized in this than I usually am. On any other day, I'd not even give this particular God-grown tree more than a slipshod glance. My attention this day is focused because I do have some ability to keep my attention on one thing as long as necessary to have a high-level ability to watch and describe, stay aware while it's happening, as my perceptual organism performs its habitual duties depending on how much I want to know about something. Most of the time, this is a totally unconscious process, and I have absolutely no awareness of either the way my eyes are moving, nor any sense of how the scene is being pieced together by the movement of the fovea clarity zoom, the jittering of my eyes all around a focus, and the much more nebulous background peripheral awarenesses. All this, often enough, is leading from scene to scene in unending swaths of scarcely aware scanning, just about all the livelong day. Another example of this unusual awareness state is I can make myself aware of the process of reading, feel my eyes move across the page, even hyperfocus on the letters making up a word of text. Or for a period of time, I can concentrate on the words I hear, making myself somewhat oblivious to their meaning and only experiencing them as complex sound. But obviously, this is a rare exercise, and in truth, makes it impossible to read or understand what is being said, because the automaton has to be unconscious. Just like thinking about walking, being hyper-conscious of every muscle, crick of my knee, bend of my ankle, etc., is not conducive to efficient locomotion. And I find that to be excessively aware of the narrow focus perception of things in my environment starts to drive me a little crazy. The whole, the living space, the world out there, seems to start to get lost a bit. Not a good thing. Now, for a minute or two, I turn away from the window and live only in my room. I feel my eyes move in what are 70, 80 degree bounces up and down, corner to corner, door to desk. My bed, 5 or 6 glances to see what a mess I left on my blankets. My bed, my computer, easel, phone plugged in, the red light now green charged. This is my room where I spend hours of my life. Because of the exercise I've been practicing, it now feels like my room is some kind of summation of all these glancings. It's probably natural and saner to believe that the world around me is integral, a space I live in. But what I'm doing here makes me feel that millions and millions of glancings of very many types are what I'm actually seeing. This is actual vision. This is actual vision, and I can be awake to it. Furthermore, in the everyday, we must recognize that words and recognitions pop up and seem to summarize visual patterns. Again, glancing out the window, I see maple tree, a label. Then turn my head and see taxi, and soon, oh, Lisa and her daughter. Or, not unusually, at time my looking stimulates a more overt awareness, a scarcely special, almost subvocal naming, such as, cool tree, oh, a pretty maple over there too. A thought is triggered by the complex of visual processing movement itself. The visual atoms, summated into visual pattern recognitions, bring with themselves summated wholes that are sometimes spoken, pop up into my mind, or experienced as inner speech fragments. Clearly, we don't verbally describe everything we see. That would drive one bonkers. But words relating to what we are seeing semi-consciously are ever ready to pop into our minds. I wish I had a Miata like that. She's a beauty, nice. That broken branch looks a bit like a Z. Actually, I'll later recognize that in the total experience, in the usual state of affairs, words are dominant, often controlling attention. Words are normative, while the visual oral spaces are exploratory and stimulatory. A bit of an aside. Scientists study this, but even they seem to end up believing that all the little glances of foveal focuses somehow truly add up to the photo awareness or some kind of actual awareness, finally, in the end, the thing itself. It's a very hard habit to give up, isn't it? What's really truthfully out there then? All our dedicated scientists who study these processes start from what I'd call the naturalistic view that we all share. Their lives, their families, their long histories as individuals, their senses, their thinking apparatuses are the same as ours. But they work on atomizing inputs and nerve groups and specific processes that, to me anyways, seem to belie the naturalistic, realistic view of perception and thinking too that they live by. It's like, as it is for all of us, they use the classical view of man and his world to tear apart the classical view, but don't realize that the two ways of seeing it are much more than antipathetic. They are radically at odds. Radical parsing of visual perception into incomprehensible fragments or atoms just doesn't reintegrate into anything like what every man purports to see. But they keep doing it anyway. What's being explored here is that the actual experience, the primordial sense experience that I just forced myself to feel, maybe for the first time in my life, is the truth of the senses, not the usual background story I've always believed. There is a definite summation, a whole, but the whole is in the domain of summated fragments, in the meaning realm, in the concept realm, not some place or space as we have allowed ourselves to believe. I don't see a maple tree. I see 362 fragmentary snaps parts that has always and will always be turned into the simple experience of immediately recognizing a tree. The truth is that it's not easy to stay awake to this cognition, to accept that I see this little square of visibility, then that, in a never-ending scatter of shards that all my life I've experienced as living in the world. Analogously, it's hard to impossible to read a section of a book and be awake to each letter, each syllable, each paragraph, each meaning sequentially added until I experience the story. Change of focus. Now I look back at my writing pad with the intention to remember what I saw, bring back to memory what I have just been looking at across the way. This is an interesting moment because the pencil paper close frame that comes into my field of vision immediately supplants all the frames of maple tree plus background that I have been scanning so obdurately. The fragments of the scene 20 feet away are replaced by another universe of quick scans, saccades, close-ups. This is also a core reality of seeing what we don't see. We believe in three-dimensional space so implicitly that we aren't aware of the constant flicker of frames, of visual fragments. It reminds me of the flicker of radically different thoughts that trundle through our noggins day in and day out. You readers can look up, scan and stay with some part of your environment, then flash back to your reader. Can you experience the absolute change of reference? These changes are so completely assimilated into our behavior sensation repertoire that we don't even see or feel them. We don't wonder about transitions because they are more than second nature to us. They are first nature. They have become our nature. It's like the brain being able to erase or glide over the split-second saccades. Presto, it's not even there. This joints seamlessly to that. The skip over is edited out. And just like the brain erases or masks the presumed blur between saccades, it just as efficiently stitches radical frame changes into our seamless experience of the world out there. If I can hold my meditation on perception awareness, I feel the radical change. My eyes were spiraling around that natural scene, that maple tree. Now they, the foveal foci, are scooting across a tiny expanse, my notebook, with writing on it. This itself is a fragment, a completely unique close-up partial scene of a very separate dimension from what I've been seeing. Constantly changing focus, holding awareness of the fragments of my perception as the foreground background changes radically is another powerful reminder that the view out there is remarkably fragmentary. My awareness, myself, immediately is inhabiting a completely and radically different scene, and all the data I've been attending to is now lost, replaced, supplanted. My eyes immediately, before will or desire, begin reading a few words on the paper in front of me, instantaneously scooting left to right. An even more circumcised visual focus, straining towards verbal meaning. There has been a quick loss of focused attention on my meditation, on my means of perception, on my eyes performing their everyday task. The thought, the awareness of wanting to be awake to how my eyes work, brings me back to my task. But I am also reminded of the strength of the draw of printed words, how much of my life is spent reading and seeing words all around that they immediately talk in my head, whether I want them to or not. Even when I choose to see words in my immediate environment as composites, composed of letters, they speak their inherent messages in my mind. This is monumentally stronger for heard speech. We cannot not hear words spoken in our environment. We cannot hear words as sounds, like the whisper of the wind. Words speak in our minds inexorably as meanings. And monumentally stronger for me is the quotidian miracle of vision that seamlessly knits together constantly changing partial glimpses into what becomes a single coherent and easily grogged scene before me. An aside. If later I wanted to paint the maple tree with background tableau, I would probably close my eyes to focus on my recently formed memory of the picture I want to create, blotting out my latest focus, my writing pad and lap, as if to hold the memory that I seem to have been creating by staying focused on the landscape that was in front of me. I would try to imagine the whole tree-knoll background ensemble, even though I never actually saw it whole and entire like I imagined. I'd probably close my eyes also to minimize attentional blink. Attentional blink massively fragments what I see and what I remember. Attentional blink is a big deal. We think that what we see is a coherent glance at the world out there, but the fragmentation is massive and pervasive. And fragments interfere with remembering other fragments massively. But that's maybe another book. The radical change of foreground background, maple tree to my painting easel, reminds me that my seeing is fragmentary in more than one way. Jumping around a tight focus of the maple gleaned many fragments, but my awareness can change scenes from very far away to very close in the most literal blink of an eye, without even being aware or whiplashed by the experience. The world of the maple tree is supplanted by the world of my writing pen, then the world of my easel in split seconds. Then again, instantaneously, there is blackness of having my eyes closed, trying to remember the scene. Cognitively, I understand that when I blink, the scene before me is disappeared for a split second. But I also know that all the blinks I do all day long are erased, or more precisely, are simply not experienced. Scientist types tell me that I blink about 15 to 20,000 times a day. Huh? I don't remember any of them. I don't remember doing any of my blinks. No, I don't shudder and startle when the world outside goes away for a split second. Just like I don't cower in terror or trauma when myself goes away for its 8-hour nap every night. We in truth don't observe many aspects of our lived lives. Much is invisible to consciousness. What is strange is that we, us humans, haven't noted the discontinuities in our perceptual intellectual apparatuses. And all the changes of perspective, changes of angle of observation, interminable bouncing around, blinking, etc., are invisible. Just like meaning is invisible in itself, and myriad upon myriad of processes my body-mind performs every second of every day are invisible. They don't, and perhaps shouldn't, enter consciousness. Another way to frame this is that we're finding that the automatons of seeing and recognizing have been so deeply channelized and normalized by the mind-body that we don't experience the underlying process. Hardly at all. Hardly ever. And our sense of the reality and truthfulness and normalcy of the everyday, plus the brain's ability to seamlessly stitch so many fragments in so many dimensions into very high-level analogs, including words we hear in our heads, make life super livable, but also super difficult to meta-analyze. At a simple but hard to swallow level, all this is a further reminder that what we see is a complete mental creation. There is nothing objective outside the skull. In spite of the world story our clan has generated and learned to believe in. Oh yeah, I'm back in front of my easel. When I try to picture the scene I've just scanned, I immediately become aware that the memory of what I was looking at is very schematic. Another form of fragmentation. I do remember a few central details and a couple of idiosyncratic details for whatever reason. but staying aware of how I'm perceiving stuff, I realized that there are many, many parts of this scene that escaped any cognizance. When I look back at the part of the maple tree I've been examining, I focus on new details that I missed the first time around. That dark smudge on the bowl, the angle that branch makes, a green-like splash on the sienna bark. And as I re-examine the maple's trunk, my fovea focus seems to find unique detail after unique detail. Then I realized that in focusing on the foreground, on the maple, I wasn't very cognizant of the geometrics of the background. When I look back at the scene and try and focus this time on the background, not the maple tree trunk I fixated on previously, now I realize that I don't really see any individual trees in the wall of trees a half mile away, silhouetting the maple. Now, forcing myself to be cognizant, holding my awareness onto a completely different atom of the scene I started with, I notice the uniqueness of the silhouette of this background bank of trees. See the particular pattern of colors of the trees and a few outstanding tree silhouettes that break the expected pattern. As a matter of fact, even with fovea zoom clarity, when I look closely and remain aware of what I'm observing, I can only really see what I recognize as a background wall of trees because I, unconsciously, seem to remember archetypes of shapes that tell me that is what I'm looking at. The actual modeled blurred silhouette of those trees far away is uniquely nondescript, impossible to characterize, seemingly random when I think about it, a colored, textured blob or a blur. The distant, blurry wall of trees is a blobbish, familiar pattern of spiky, far away, dark green and shadow. I have a recognition. It doesn't really look like anything. It's a bit random shaped and a color texture, but I don't really see anything specifically tree-ish. What I'm saying is that the squiggly textures that tell me that I'm looking at trees at a distance are actually quite nondescript and scarcely account for my knowledge of a forest of individual trees. I recognize the forest because I have a complex and deep visual forest concept gestalt, well established, and the forms that flit before my eyes clearly conform to such an abstraction. It feels like my mind must constantly be filling in the blanks. An aside. As mentioned a few times, Hofstadter and Sanders in Surfaces and Essences developed the understanding that simple words encode quite complexly embedded chunks of data that summate long ago and numerous encounters with the world experience and make it possible to immediately know great gobs of implicit experience in hierarchical depth. Each concept is organically constructed over time and complexly related to many thousands of other concepts. The compound word maple tree concatenates and enables almost immediately relating to many other salient nodal connections relating to maple and of course tree. It concatenates great gobs of millisecond retrievable, related, and long embedded concepts. Analogously, this is true of the physical data structures, visual percepts, that allow me to recognize the blobbish and mostly nondescript fovea fragment that eventually turns into the recognition of trees in the distance. The cerebrum somehow joints the sensorium into perceived wholes, while language joints the world. Language itself is the mega concatenation of the mega concatenation that is visual perception. Concatenation isn't simple inclusion of concept within other concepts, but is kind of a dynamic self-assembly, like molecular jointings in chemistry, that result in the end results being more than the sum of the constituent parts. I further realize also that my memory of any and almost all of the details that I've been looking at is minimal. The way the shadows fall, the silhouette of the tree line, the texture when the line turns from beech to maple and back again, all are recognized only by extremely minute observation based on past recognitions or images that help me guess what I'm seeing better. Today, this recognition or awareness comes from an unnatural focus on parts of the whole that normally I would not be aware of in the least. And as I scan words, beech, fir, pine, there's an eagle in a branch, arise of themselves to further differentiate the visual. In the usual quick glance of at such a scene, I wouldn't recognize any of these individual characteristics, and I certainly wouldn't necessarily name parts of the whole or even see the individual components of the whole. Most of the time, my eyes would cursorily sweep the general area and know what I'm seeing from almost nondescript cues, non-consciously gleaned. In the unnaturally close focus of my exercise, I keep coming back, sweeping the scene, holding pieces in my mind and trying to fix the colors, shapes, proportions, gleaning more than the usual data. I also recognize that in my exercise, in trying to remember the scene better, as if trying to have an image to paint, I can't stop describing the scene. The description starts itself almost subvocally, seeming in an attempt to fix my knowledge, hold on to what is in front of me. In truth, if I wanted to truly remember the scene, I'd immediately start talking about it, describing it in minute detail. That burl is right there, 2/3 of the way down, dark sienna-like, a white, dirty brown fungi over there, stippled gray whorl to the left. This tells me something about my memories of scenes and how they are fixed in my mind. Part of the extraordinary genius of humankind is the automaton that gives us the ability to wordify what we perceive. And the retrieved words can give rise to the experience of perceiving in my mind's eye, at least in a storybook verbal description sort of way, what we perceived. Furthermore, now that I'm turned away from what I was so assiduously studying, watching the maple tree, trying as I might, I cannot remember the shape, the geometric details, the idiosyncrasies of this particular tree line. And as we know, if I look sideways at another beautiful maple tree I'm so entitled to have on my property, I realize how quickly all I've been studying, attempting to memorize, goes away, evaporates. Attentional blink. One replaces the other and interferes with the remembrance of the other. Just like sentences erase previous sentences and new scenes replace scenes I've just glanced at. Even when I look at it with intense desire to remember, it just will not stay with me. And when I look in any different direction. When I focus on the tree line to the right, for example, I see a different geometry, but in truth, it makes no particular sense to me. It is just one of the near infinite differences of detail that every scene must have. Then I might again look at the individual maple tree, the foreground image. I see a specific shape that I believe in my abstract mind must be unique. I'm looking at a unique angle. There are infinite angles from which I can look at this maple, after all. I can shuffle 15 feet to the right and see a different tree. It is made up of textures and forms, all seen at a specific angle, from a specific distance, in a unique light. If I move a few feet, I can have another uniquely specific view. And in an hour, the light will, in truth, show something radically different from this scene. But I again find, when I look away, I can recall some basic forms, but very little about this actual maple. I remind you that an artist could draw the scene, or I could photograph the scene and look at the scene again later, consciously and assiduously trying to remember, fix this particular scene in me, in my memory. But this is not the same process at all. As a matter of fact, the process of going over something, especially a visual scene, to squeeze it into memory, is not at all an average human process. It's more akin to the implantation of knowledges, the fixing of linked data, words, for later recall. And I believe that what we do in this other process, what an artist might do, is we link descriptions, construct a word palace of individual observations linked verbally that allow us to semi-recreate the memorized image. And then, having filled in the blanks, we believe and are told or hinted at that this constructed gestalt is what we have in our remembrance, in our memory. While in truth, what we have are fragmentary archetypes of many simple parts of wholes that we can splice together when we need to. What I'm grogging, feeling, is that the world we live in is made up of whole existence out there, like our native What I'm grogging, feeling, is that the world we live in is made up not of whole existence out there, like our native mind and theories of knowledge seem to imply. We see, via hundreds of millions of small eye movement shots, that our brains seem to be able, in millisecond bursts of integrative creation, to recognize and turn into types of things, abstracts of trees, people, rocks, through the sharp focused foveal retinal movement of my eyes. It comes down to a mechanism to acquire simple abstract awareness of trees, corners, maps, friends' faces, which are usable. Though what is actually fixed in most everyday looking is much, much less detailed than we imagine. Examining my tree in much more than usual detail. On average, I would have stitched together 1,500 saccade foveal glimpses in 5 minutes. In the background, I don't and really can't make out the individuals in the wall of trees, though I intuit that they must be there. And today, in spite of unusually tenacious observing, as soon as I look away, begin sweeping other scenes, this particular scene is almost immediately lost, replaced by the movie reel, continual scanning of everyday life. Another book could be written that would also factor in the incredible imperfection of our everyday human perception of the world, plus imperfections of memory, mostly invisible but extremely powerful processes such as attentional blindness, masking, and perceptual interference, short-term memory overload, change blindness, and the rapid decay of almost all the memory of perceived things in a day. And somewhat recently, we, scientist types anyway, have been becoming more aware of built-in flaws and discontinuities of both the organs of perception, optical and other types of illusions, and the thinking, processing, central processor, our brain, organic machine. This is another clear indication of the constructed nature of perceived reality, and also a reminder of the myth of the idealized world. And lastly, and tantalizingly, we, scientist types anyways, are just beginning to explore how memory, all memory of every modality, appears to be near instantaneous recreation or reintegration of once perceived patterns. It's as if the hyper-astronomically connected cerebral tissue receives, organizes a gestalt of a red bug. This is just an example. Gestalt means a complex of innervations mapped together. In order to remember that red bug, the global brain system reconstitutes the overall pattern through re-triggering the perceptual modules that originally participated in integrating the incoming data. Whew, eh? But what else could it be? The red bug isn't inside my brain. Memories of things aren't the thing themselves in our brains. The input instantiates a high-level multimodal analog. The high-level multimodal analog then can be reinstantiated and processed back into the original input, back into an analog of the original input. And this reconstituted analog represents the earlier experiences, is experienced as a stand-in for what was previously perceived. We must recognize that this isn't a computer or processing model of linear discrete steps. It's completely and radically different. Living tissue is complexly disturbed. Tissue is long-term electrochemically patterned via extremely complex webs of synchronized interactivity, which itself is patterned by world-brain-body correspondences. And the tissue, the brain, inter and intra-connected. The tissue can reproduce, partially, very imperfectly, but effectively, the original disturbances that relate them together. Down the line, in later encoding, the brain can reconstitute some of these patterns multimodally as memory and can super effectively store very high-level summations as unconscious meanings that appear to the individual as words in my head. Words, memories, present functioning gleanings are always processing the life space unconsciously in multimodal dimensions, always juxtaposing and gestalting all the atoms of experience at all levels. Cool, eh? This is, I believe, a whole new and until now hidden aspect of our being in the world that is probably the only way to imagine how the material brain can be said to know the world. What else could it be? How else could it be without an ultimate homunculus? But this story about visual perception is not the standard story we tell ourselves and tell our children. We've stumbled across the doorstep of an uncomfortable but deep reality of life. Phenomenologically, this is vision, and this is what all us mammals, simians, and primates do all our waking lives. Another important insight from neuropsychology and AI is the need to forget. The millions of inputs per second must be pared down, immediately parsed, and unconsciously cataloged, sorted, recognized, but also the output of the parsing must be immediately passed on to the next module. that will know what to do with its quanta of raw data. The raw data is flushed quickly if the amount of information is not to exponentialize almost immediately. The retinal ganglion cells, the colliculi, the visual cortex systems hold nothing. And the brain itself holds nothing but resonating loops of reproducible patterns that entrain other resonating loops. The loops ensure our survival, just like for all other higher animals. The world out there is created, recreated instantaneously, as needs be. Not only are we unaware of how fovea snaps integrate, but we are unaware that this is how we are experiencing the visual. It is invisible to us. And 30 or 50 snaps give me the gestalt I need to navigate the local environment, and they are completely evanescent. And what I saw this morning also is lost, though I can sometimes remember a story about what I saw, thought, or did. And most standard thoughts are evanescent. We actually, most of us, remember little of our lived lives. Evanescent, evanescent, evanescent. In this exercise, I made myself awake to, aware of, the evanescent data of these everyday glances, its lack of permanency. And furthermore, we will recognize later, as we develop these thoughts, the irrelevancy of perception much of the time, for us humans really, except to create word experiences. Nothing will remain of the thousands of visual glancings, saccades, just like nothing will remain of the 100,000 words in my own head firstly, but also from y'all, heard from my neighbors, that I'll hear this same day. On a much larger and longer scale, nothing will remain of the millions or billions of frames of television scenes I'll watch in my life, except for the fragmentary memory of a story that tickles my fancy. And nothing will remain of the thousands of individual words my temporal lobe word box recognizes each day from books or articles. The world out there is truly evanescent, which ultimately we experience finally and inexorably in death itself. But that's not what we tell ourselves, not what the clan has decreed. Let us suppose that light impinging on the retina instantiates patterns of things in themselves. Things in themselves is a bastardization of Heidegger's being in itself, which is a metaphor. All words are only pointers, tokens, metaphors, summations. To say light encodes information is to use a computer metaphor instead of another word from another science. The light patterns disturb retinal tissue differentially, which disturb many other tissues in complex ways. We might call this processing, but that is also a computer metaphor and somewhat teleological. Somewhat stable and important further discriminative electrochemical patterns become recurring, which, as ensembles of organic patterns, eventually entrain behaviors, which have allowed the individual animal to live in its environment more adaptively, a word from biology. The brain patterns are such that they dynamically, modularly interact in almost indescribably complex feedback loops, which in their final expression can be summarily described as analogous to a cybernetic homeostatic survival system. All that the animal experiences, though, is unending, partial, emergent, and deeply cross-linked coherences at very high levels of integration, resulting in movement, behavior, sensation, response to environment, and very high-level adaptation needs, which result in success. The adaptation needs are nurturing, procreation, perduring as an organism for as long as possible. And for humans, eventually, the further elaboration of verbal conceptual differentiation that adapts us even more efficiently to the level of our experience of our environment. And as I see and live and use my visual spatial world, at the same time, I think, talk to myself, and live in the parallel world of words that are my primary habitat in many respects. And universally, I believe both what I see and hear. I believe the world surrounds me and extends from the end of my nose way out there and beyond, into space. And I believe what I hear. I believe what people tell me, what they describe, and the stories they tell me. This is an important reminder that for most of our lives, the foreground awareness, that which is really the primary data of our social, cultural experience, that which we are mostly attending to, is the story, the word stream that goes through our minds continually, including the story I tell myself about myself day in and day out. I. At the same time, various perceptual streams are experienced as the background awareness. And, as with visual perception, foreground and background can switch almost instantaneously, and they quickly intermix. As I look at a scene, usually, if I'm in my everyday semi-unconscious perceptual mode, what I'm doing is talking to myself, having conversation fragments go through my mind, paying scant attention to what I'm looking at. The scene, usually in most circumstances, is quite secondary to the conversation fragments going through my head. Yet, in a literal split second, my mind switches attention to something in the visual field that must be attended to. And back again to thoughts. This is one of the most important truths about humanity, I believe. We think we are perceiving the real world pretty accurately, but most of the time we are self-talking thinking. Change of focus. Yesterday I took a ride along a beautiful, very long lake in my car. For the 2 hours driving, I tried to keep aware of the road and the breathtaking scenery all around me, and of myself. One thing I was aware of was that every few seconds, a completely different scene impinged on my visual field. This is obvious, but if I sit still, one scene stays with me, maybe even for hours. But in a car, there's one scene after the other in quick succession. This is different from sitting and looking at my stationary maple tree. Thousands and hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of trees and groups of trees sped by. They formed unique, I presume, visual patterns that I didn't see. This was a 24,000 saccade trip, a passel of foveal snaps. When I tried to see what I was seeing, understand how my awareness was happening, I was aware that in the split seconds that I had to take in any part of the scene, I couldn't hold on to any particular at all. That fir across the road stretched just like so, then the wall of deciduous alder, then the overhanging branches. All of it was like a continual visual reel that never stopped, but which could not stay with me in any meaningful way. A not bad example of using the environment instrumentally, using our environment, our surroundings as furniture. All the visual reel, R-E-E-L, all the visual reel does, in a way of looking at it, is provide a corridor for me to drive through. Most of the time, we enjoy glancing at this or that fragment, but we were not really trying to understand or remember the scenes we encounter. While driving, my focus was dragged to the center of the road continually to check approaching cars, the fovea continually, hundreds of times a minute it felt like, giving me data as to the curve, angle, and condition of the road. But in truth, nothing in detail about the trip remains in my imagination except some vague after images of certain glorious scenes. I do have kind of block memories of the route. I've traveled it many times, but each time I pass through, the actual experience is passing through a wonderful blur, a constant input of many atoms of perception that appear in my visual field, but which just as quickly are lost and gone forever. Not one of the individual snapshots of trees is retrievable as any kind of clear memory. And again, there were many times when, between watching the road and trying to take in the scenery, that narrative thought, snatches of memory, and pieces of important aspects of my life, emotional needs mostly, brought ideas and feelings into my mind, while my perceptual consciousness took over, watching for oncoming traffic and possible changes to the environment that might signal something untoward or dangerous. Remarkable the worlds we live in. And if I had a big predominant worry, the mortgage just can't be paid this month. My wife may be thinking of leaving our relationship. My child has a serious illness. I could have easily spent the whole drive gnawing anxious ideas, having neither the ability nor the inclination to think or feel philosophically about the nature of perception. Thinking about the nature of perception, thinking, and other high and mighty themes. Yet, I would have navigated and used the road to arrive at my destination, even though I lived my anxiety most of the time as I drove. And in truth, I would say for most people, most of the time, we spend the largest portion of our lives in such a state of anxious rumination. It's part of our primate heritage.